Emily never liked working the night shift at Walmart, but she had no choice. She needed money for her studies, and this job offered the highest pay. That evening, she arrived at work as usual at 1:00 p.m. The huge supermarket building, surrounded by an endless sea of asphalt, looked ominous in the streetlights. The first few hours passed as usual. Emily stocked shelves, occasionally helping the few night shoppers. Around 1 in the morning, she noticed a strange man slowly wandering the aisles. He was wearing a long coat despite the warm weather and constantly looking around. Emily tried to ignore him, but felt shivers down her spine every time he passed by. At 2 o'clock, the store was empty. Emily was glad the strange man had finally left. She continued her work, enjoying the silence. Suddenly, the lights in the store began to flicker. At first, she thought it was just a power outage, but then she noticed that the lights were going out sequentially, row by row, approaching her. Emily's heart began to race. She rushed to the service exit, but the door was locked. Panic gripped her as she realized she was trapped. In the darkness, she heard approaching footsteps. Emily hid behind a shelf of canned goods, trying not to breathe. The footsteps stopped nearby. In the dim light of the emergency lamps, she saw the silhouette of the same man in the coat. He was mumbling something under his breath, slowly running his hand along the shelves. Emily froze, afraid to move. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned his head in her direction. Emily held her breath. Time seemed to stand still. But then the man walked on, disappearing into the darkness of the store. Emily didn't know how long she sat behind the shelf, trembling with fear. Finally, she gathered all her courage and decided to try to find a way out. Carefully, trying not to make noise, she began to make her way through the dark aisles. Wandering through the store, Emily noticed that something had changed. The aisles seemed longer than usual, and the layout of the departments was different. It was as if she had ended up in some twisted, nighttime version of Walmart. In the electronics department, the TV screens suddenly came to life, showing static. Emily jumped in surprise. As she looked closer, she thought she saw faces in the static, distorted, screaming faces. Turning away from the eerie sight, Emily saw a shadow flicker at the end of the aisle. She started running in the opposite direction, but no matter which way she turned, it seemed the shadow was always one step ahead. Finally, Emily reached the clothing department. She hid among the rows of clothes, trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, she noticed that the mannequins were oddly turned towards her. In the dim light, their plastic faces seemed almost alive, with an expression of cold curiosity. Emily closed her eyes, hoping it was just her imagination. When she opened them again, the mannequins were even closer, surrounding her on all sides. She screamed and ran away, pushing aside the plastic figures. Running blindly, Emily crashed into something hard. It was a cart full of groceries, but something was wrong. The products in the cart were rotten, covered in mold. The stench was unbearable. Emily recoiled and noticed that all the products around were in the same condition, spoiled, rotten, as if the store had been abandoned for many years. In desperation, Emily ran to the main entrance, but instead of the usual automatic doors, she saw only a bare wall. She started pounding on it with her fists, begging for help. Suddenly, the wall under her hands became soft, as if alive. Emily recoiled in horror, watching as the outlines of a face appeared on the wall. The face on the wall opened its eyes and looked directly at Emily. Its mouth stretched into an unnaturally wide smile. Emily screamed and ran away, not knowing where she was going. She found herself in the toy department. Dolls and stuffed animals seemed to be watching her with their glass eyes. Suddenly, she heard a child's laughter. Looking around, Emily saw a little girl standing at the end of the aisle. The girl waved at her and disappeared around the corner. Not knowing what to do, Emily followed the girl. She turned the corner and found herself in an unfamiliar corridor. The walls were covered with mirrors, but the reflections in them were distorted. Emily saw herself old, young, dead, thousands of variations of herself looking at her from the mirrors. At the end of the corridor, she saw a door with the sign "Exit." Emily's heart beat faster with hope. She rushed to the door, desperately trying to open it. Finally, the door gave way. Emily ran outside and found herself inside the store again. She was standing in the center of a huge atrium she had never seen before in her Walmart. Around her were hundreds of people, shoppers, employees, security guards. They were all frozen like statues, staring directly at her. Emily covered her face with her hands, feeling despair overwhelming her. When she looked up again, all the people had disappeared. Instead, she saw the man in the coat standing right in front of her. The man slowly removed his hood, revealing his face. Emily realized with horror that she was looking at herself. Her doppelganger smiled and reached out her hand. When their fingers touched, the reality around them began to disintegrate. Emily screamed, feeling the floor disappear beneath her feet. She was falling into an abyss, surrounded by fragments of her nightmare. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and found herself lying on the floor in the household chemicals department. Concerned colleagues and a few night shoppers were standing around her. The manager helped her up, explaining that she had fainted while working. Emily looked around. The store looked normal, the lights were on, people were calmly walking the aisles. Everything seemed ordinary, but deep inside she felt that something had changed. As Emily walked home after her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She looked back at the Walmart building looming behind her. For a moment she thought she saw her own face in a second-floor window. But when she blinked, the vision disappeared. Emily quickened her pace, trying to convince herself that it was all just a dream. But deep down, she knew that this night had forever changed her perception of reality. Now she understood that behind the bright facade of an ordinary supermarket, something dark and incomprehensible could be hiding. From that day on, Emily became much more cautious. She always checked if the doors were locked, avoided dark places, and never worked the night shift again. But sometimes, passing by Walmart, she felt an inexplicable fear overtaking her. And in such moments, it seemed to her that the store building was looking at her, waiting for her return to its eerie, twisted world. Mark never thought that a routine trip to Walmart could turn into a nightmare. That evening, he decided to stop by the 24-hour store to pick up a few necessities. The clock was nearing midnight when he pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. The massive supermarket building cast eerie shadows in the light of the few working street lamps. Mark parked as close to the entrance as possible, feeling an inexplicable unease. He quickly got out of his car and headed for the automatic doors. Inside, the store seemed unnaturally quiet. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed dimly, creating the illusion that the entire space was vibrating. Mark grabbed a cart and began his journey down the long aisles between the shelves. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Mark methodically collected the items he needed, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that someone was watching him. He had almost convinced himself it was just his imagination when he noticed a strange figure at the end of the aisle. It was a man in a Walmart employee vest, but something about his posture seemed off. He stood completely still, like a mannequin, staring directly at Mark. When their eyes met, the man suddenly vanished around the corner. Perplexed, Mark decided to hurry with his shopping. He moved quickly between the rows, tossing items into his cart almost without looking. When he turned a corner, he saw the same employee again. This time, the man was standing closer, still motionless, with an unnaturally wide smile on his face. Mark's heart began to race. He turned and quickly walked in the opposite direction. Passing by the electronics department, he noticed that all the TV screens suddenly turned on. They showed static, but Mark thought he could see outlines of faces screaming silently in the noise. Turning away from the eerie sight, Mark quickened his pace. He decided to get to the checkout as fast as possible and leave this place. But when he reached the front of the store, he was horrified to find all the registers empty. No cashiers or other shoppers were in sight. Panic began to overtake Mark. He abandoned his cart and ran to the exit, but the automatic doors didn't open. He pushed them, pounded on them with his fists, but they remained immovable, like a solid wall. Mark turned around and saw the vested employee standing just a few meters away. Now Mark could see his face more clearly, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The man's eyes were completely black, without whites, and his smile stretched literally from ear to ear, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Without thinking, Mark bolted deeper into the store. He raced down the aisles, knocking over shelves behind him, trying to slow down his pursuer. But no matter which way he turned, it seemed the vested man always appeared right in front of him, still wearing that unnatural smile. Despair gripped Mark as he realized he was lost among endless rows of merchandise. The aisles seemed longer than he remembered, and the layout of the departments had changed. He could no longer figure out where the entrance was. Suddenly, Mark noticed a door marked "Employees Only." With no other choice, he rushed towards it and was relieved to find it unlocked. He ran inside and slammed the door behind him. Finding himself in a dark corridor, Mark felt for a light switch. When the light flashed on, he saw that he was in an enormous warehouse. Tall metal shelves stretched for what seemed like miles upward and into the distance. Mark began to make his way between the rows, hoping to find another exit. But the further he went, the more he realized something was wrong. The shelves didn't hold ordinary goods, but strange artifacts, antique dolls with creepy smiles, jars containing what looked like human organs, books whose covers appeared to be made of something resembling human skin. Horror gripped Mark as he realized he had ended up in some nightmarish version of Walmart, where the darkest and most terrifying things were stored. He wanted to flee, but understood that he had long since lost his bearings in this labyrinth of shelves. Suddenly, Mark heard footsteps. They were approaching from all sides, echoing off the metal structures. Figures in Walmart vests began to appear from around corners. There were dozens, hundreds of them, all with the same black eyes and unnatural smiles. Mark screamed and started running blindly. He raced between shelves, jumped over boxes, desperately searching for an exit. The figures pursued him, their numbers seemingly growing constantly. Finally, Mark saw light ahead. It was a door with an exit sign glowing above it. Gathering his last strength, he sprinted towards it. Behind him, the Walmart-vested creatures were already reaching out their hands with long, sharp fingers. Mark slammed into the door with all his might, and it burst open. Bright light blinded him for a moment. Mark opened his eyes to find himself lying on the asphalt of the Walmart parking lot. Concerned people stood around him. Someone had called an ambulance. It turned out he had fainted just after getting out of his car. Paramedics examined Mark and said everything was fine, just a sudden bout of dizziness. They offered to take him to the hospital for a more detailed examination, but Mark refused. He felt normal, although confused by what had happened. As the crowd dispersed, Mark slowly got to his feet. He looked at the Walmart building, which now seemed entirely ordinary in the early morning light. But deep inside, he felt that something had changed. Mark got into his car and drove away, deciding never to visit this store again. On the way home, he couldn't shake the feeling that his experience was something more than just a hallucination or a dream. Perhaps he had inadvertently glimpsed behind the veil of reality and seen something he wasn't meant to see. From that day on, Mark became much more cautious. He avoided late-night trips to stores and was always on guard in large shopping centers. He knew that behind the ordinary facade of everyday life, something dark and incomprehensible might be hiding. And although most people never encounter it, Mark understood that the boundary between our world and something else, something eerie and dangerous, might be thinner than we think. Every time he drove past Walmart, Mark felt shivers run down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere there, behind the bright windows and welcoming signs, another Walmart was waiting for him, a dark, twisted world ready to pull an unwary visitor into its depths. And he knew he would never risk checking if his experience had been real again. Sarah never liked working the night shift at Walmart, but she needed money for her studies. That evening, she arrived at work as usual at 11:00 p.m. The massive supermarket building looked ominous in the dim light of the parking lot. The first few hours passed quietly. Sarah stocked shelves, occasionally helping the few night shoppers. Around 2 a.m, she noticed a strange woman slowly wandering the departments. The woman was wearing a long dress, despite the summer weather, and constantly mumbling to herself. Sarah tried to ignore her, but felt shivers down her spine every time the woman passed by. After a while, Sarah noticed that the woman had disappeared, and she returned to work with relief. Around 3 a.m, Sarah heard a strange noise from the warehouse area. She went to check what was happening. Opening the warehouse door, she saw that several boxes had fallen from the shelves. As Sarah began to pick them up, she suddenly felt the temperature in the room drop sharply. Her breath turned to vapor in the cold air. Sarah turned around and saw the same woman standing right behind her. Now, Sarah could see her face more clearly, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The woman's eyes were completely white, without pupils, and her skin had a grayish tinge, as if she were a corpse. Sarah screamed and ran from the warehouse. She raced through the store aisles, trying to reach the exit. But no matter which way she turned, it seemed the woman always appeared right in front of her, materializing out of nowhere. Despair gripped Sarah when she realized she was lost among endless rows of merchandise. The aisles seemed longer than she remembered, and the layout of the departments had changed. She could no longer figure out where the exit was. Suddenly, Sarah noticed a group of mannequins in the clothing department. She hid among them, trying to catch her breath. But when she looked around, she realized with horror that the mannequins were slowly turning their heads towards her, their plastic eyes staring directly at her. Sarah screamed and ran on. She found herself in the electronics department, where all the televisions suddenly turned on. The screens showed the image of the same woman who had been chasing her. Hundreds of pairs of white eyes stared at Sarah from the screens. In panic, Sarah rushed to the service exit. She ran out into the parking lot, but it looked completely different from what she remembered. Instead of asphalt, there was soft, muddy ground under her feet. The cars in the parking lot were old and rusty, as if they had been standing there for decades. Sarah ran to where her car should have been, but found it had vanished. Instead, she saw an old, rusty car that looked as if it had just been pulled from a swamp. Through the windshield, she saw the same woman sitting behind the wheel, smiling at her. Sarah screamed and ran away from the parking lot. She ran blindly, trying to escape this nightmare. Suddenly, she tripped and fell. Sarah opened her eyes and found herself lying on the floor in the household chemicals department. Concerned colleagues and a few night shoppers stood around her. The manager helped her up, explaining that she had fainted while working. Sarah looked around. The store looked normal. The lights were on. People were calmly walking the aisles. Everything seemed ordinary, but deep inside, she felt that something had changed. When her shift ended, Sarah went out to the parking lot. She was relieved to see her car in its usual spot. But when she got in and looked in the rearview mirror, for a moment she thought she saw the same white-eyed woman in the back seat. When she quickly turned around, there was no one there. Sarah drove home quickly, deciding never to work the night shift again. On the way, she couldn't shake the feeling that her experience was something more than just a hallucination or a dream. Perhaps she had inadvertently glimpsed behind the veil of reality and seen something she wasn't meant to see. From that day on, Sarah became much more cautious. She avoided late-night trips to stores and was always on guard in large shopping centers. She knew that behind the ordinary facade of everyday life, something dark and incomprehensible might be hiding. And although most people never encounter it, Sarah understood that the boundary between our world and something else, something eerie and dangerous, might be thinner than we think. Every time she drove past Walmart, Sarah felt shivers run down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere there, behind the bright windows and welcoming signs, another Walmart was waiting for her, a dark, twisted world ready to pull an unwary visitor into its depths, and she knew she would never risk checking if her experience had been real again. This event changed Sarah forever. She became more attentive to her surroundings, especially at night. She learned to trust her intuition and never ignored feelings of danger, even if they seemed unfounded. Sarah often wondered if other people had encountered similar experiences. She began to notice that some shoppers in Walmart had the same frightened look that she had after that night. Sometimes she thought she saw a glimmer of understanding in their eyes, as if they too had experienced something similar. Over time, Sarah learned to live with her experience. She no longer worked at Walmart, but sometimes, passing by the store during the day, she felt a strange attraction. Part of her wanted to return to check if it had all been real, but another part, wiser and more cautious, always held her back from taking that step. Sarah knew that some secrets are better left uncovered. She decided to use her experience to help others. She began volunteering at a local support center for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, understanding that her story, though incredible, might help others cope with their fears. And although Sarah's life returned to normal, she never forgot that night at Walmart. It remained a constant reminder that the world is much more complex and mysterious than we can imagine, and that sometimes the greatest horrors hide behind the most ordinary facades.